Ben McMahon. A semi-trailer runs a red light somewhere in Melbourne and hits a car at full speed. A 22-year-old Australian named Ben McMahon fractures his sternum, shatters his ribs, and drops into an induced coma for 1 week. When he opens his eyes, a Chinese nurse is leaning over him. The first words out of his mouth are fluent Mandarin. The nurse stepped back. She went out into the hallway and found his parents. She told them, "Your son is woken up, but he is speaking Chinese." His parents, who speak no Mandarin, could not hold a conversation with their own son for the next several days. His first written communication from the hospital bed was a note in Chinese characters. It read, "I love my mom. I love my dad. I will recover." His first spoken words, documented by SBS News Australia in 2013, were a single Mandarin sentence directed at the nurse. "Nurse, I feel really sore here." Not a memorized phrase, not a halting translation, a complete, natural, spontaneous sentence in a language he supposedly barely knew. McMahon had studied Mandarin briefly at a Melbourne high school. By his own account, he was nowhere near fluent. Basic classroom phrases, nothing more. But after the coma, his internal monologue switched entirely to Mandarin. He told Vice in 2019 that there was no first thinking English, then translating to Chinese. It was, he said, just straight Chinese. He did not translate, he simply thought in Mandarin. His English took several additional days to return, and when it did, it came back as the secondary language. Neurologists proposed a structural explanation. The left side of his brain, where English language processing is dominant for native English speakers, received the majority of the traumatic impact from the collision. Mandarin speakers, according to research into bilingual neural organization, tend to use both hemispheres more than native English speakers do. The hypothesis is that the less injured right hemisphere remained available for Mandarin retrieval while the left hemisphere rested and repaired. Neurolinguist Michel Paradis of McGill University confirmed to multiple outlets that sudden second language emergence of this kind is, in his words, not that rare in the context of traumatic brain injury affecting dominant hemisphere language circuits. McMahon subsequently enrolled in advanced Mandarin at Melbourne University, represented Australia in an international language competition, moved to Shanghai, and hosted If You Are the One, a Chinese dating show broadcast to an estimated 50 million viewers per episode. The accident that nearly killed him redirected the entire trajectory of his life. The mainstream explanation runs something like this. Dormant Mandarin pathways laid down during school study survived the trauma intact while the dominant English circuits were temporarily disrupted. As the brain rerouted processing around the damaged left hemisphere, Mandarin became the path of least resistance. The mechanism in this framing is not miraculous. It is neurological triage. But here is what that explanation quietly sidesteps. McMahon had never been fluent in Mandarin. He was not a capable second language speaker who lost English and fell back on something he genuinely knew. The fluency itself appeared from the injury. He was producing Mandarin at a level he had never previously reached. The language was better on the other side of a coma than it was going in. Some researchers now ask whether the brain stores more than we consciously practice. Whether passive exposure, overhearing, partially absorbing, encountering without studying, creates neural architecture that trauma can suddenly activate. If injury can unlock that architecture, the question becomes, what else is stored in every one of us that we will never access unless something breaks? We may never know. What we do know is that a Chinese nurse walked into a Melbourne ICU expecting to find a recovering Australian and found something else entirely. From a sunlit Australian road, we travel 70 years back to a darker night, a falling bomb, and the most politically dangerous accent a human brain has ever accidentally produced. Astrid L. On the 6th of September, 1941, the German-occupied city of Oslo was attacked by the British Royal Air Force. Citizens caught in the open ran for whatever shelter they could find. A 30-year-old Norwegian woman named Astrid was among them, sprinting for cover when a piece of shrapnel struck the left side of her skull. She collapsed on the street. Hospital staff who treated her that night believed she would not survive. She survived. And when she eventually relearned to speak, her neighbors accused her of being a Nazi spy. 2 years after the injury, Astrid's case came to the attention of Georg Hermann Monrad Krohn, professor of neurology at the University of Oslo, a man with a specialized research interest in language disorders. He later wrote that when he first heard her speak, he assumed she must be German or French. She had never left Norway. She had never met a German soldier. She had never studied any foreign language in any formal capacity. He began documenting everything. Her words were Norwegian. Her vocabulary was Norwegian. Her grammar was Norwegian. Monrad Krohn tested her singing ability specifically and found it entirely intact. She could hum and carry a tune without any distortion. But her prosody, the rhythm, the pitch, the intonation, the millisecond-level stress patterns that carry language the way a current carries a boat, had shifted to something that every Norwegian listener who heard her independently identified as unmistakably German. In Nazi-occupied Norway in 1941, this was not a medical curiosity. It was social devastation. She reported being refused service at shops. Merchants assumed she was a German collaborator or an occupier. Monrad Krohn recorded her complaint directly. She was, in his words, constantly being taken for a German in the shops, where consequently the assistants would sell her nothing. She was not performing. She was not choosing this. She was a Norwegian woman who had survived a shrapnel wound and woken up sounding like the enemy. Monrad Krohn published his definitive case study in 1947. It remains one of the most cited papers in the history of neurolinguistics. He coined the term dysprosody to describe her condition, a disruption specifically of the musical layer of language, not of its vocabulary or grammar. Neurolinguist Harry Whittaker formally named the broader condition foreign accent syndrome in a 1982 paper, drawing directly on Monrad Krohn's documentation of Astrid as the foundational case. Between 1941 and 2009, a span of 68 years, only 62 cases of foreign accent syndrome were formally documented in the entire medical literature. Astrid's is the most cited of all of them. A subsequent meta-analysis of 112 patients found that 67% were female, 97% were adults, and, crucially, only 12.5% had any prior documented exposure to the accent that emerged after their injury. Neurologists now understand, or believe they understand, what Astrid's neighbors heard. Her brain, damaged by shrapnel, had lost the ability to precisely coordinate the timing and muscle tension of her speech articulators. The result was a distortion of prosody that happened to resemble to Norwegian ears the patterns of German speech. According to Professor Nick Miller of Newcastle University, the notion that sufferers speak in a foreign language is something that is in the ear of the listener rather than the mouth of the speaker. She was not producing German, she was producing damaged Norwegian. The accent, in this view, was a projection, but every single Norwegian who heard her independently landed on the same conclusion. Not French, not Swedish, not Danish, German. If the output were truly random prosodic damage, interpretations should scatter. Instead, they clustered around a single specific language. the language of the occupying army. Something about the particular disruption to Astrid's particular speech system generated an output that resembled exactly one foreign language to every person in the room. Some researchers ask whether the brain's prosodic system, when disrupted, might fall toward patterns it has passively absorbed rather than generating random noise. Could Astrid have unconsciously accumulated German prosody through ambient exposure, German radio broadcasts, the sounds of soldiers during the occupation, overheard speech she never consciously registered? And if that kind of passive absorption can be stored this deeply, what sonic environments are quietly encoding themselves in all of us right now? From the frozen streets of occupied Oslo, we cross to the Californian desert, where a different kind of identity will be erased. Not just a language, but a name, a face, and an entire self. Michael Boatwright. Police find a 61-year-old man unconscious on the floor of a Motel 6 room in Palm Springs, California. The date is the 28th of February, 2013. He has 4 forms of identification on him: a passport, a California ID card, a veteran's medical card, a social security card. Every document says the same name: Michael Thomas Boatwright. He is transported to Desert Regional Medical Center. When he wakes, he does not recognize any of those documents. He says his name is Johan Ek. He speaks only Swedish. He has no memory of speaking English. He has no memory of anything at all. Nurses tried to question him. He answered entirely in Swedish. Shown his own face on his identification cards, he did not recognize it. Social worker Lisa Hunt Vasquez was assigned to the case and told the Desert Sun newspaper that he did not know how to exchange money, take public transportation, or find temporary housing. He remembered no family members, no ex-wives, no son. He had $180 in accessible funds and a $7 balance in a Chinese bank account he could partially access. He was carrying tennis rackets. Hospital officials noted he may have been in Palm Springs for a tennis tournament in the Coachella Valley. That detail, tennis rackets, exercise clothes, a backpack, was essentially the entire picture of who he was that anyone could piece together from what he had brought into that motel room. Doctors at Desert Regional Medical Center formally diagnosed Boatwright with transient global amnesia in a dissociative fugue state in March of 2013, a finding documented by the Desert Sun, NPR, and CBS News. Transient global amnesia is characterized by a sudden inability to form or access memories, often combined with sudden and unplanned travel and possible adoption of a new identity. Boatwright's case met all 3 diagnostic criteria simultaneously. Swedish public records confirmed he had lived in Sweden on and off from 1981 to 2003, more than 20 years. Former members of the Society for Creative Anachronism, a medieval history organization, confirmed he had been active in its Swedish chapter and participated in jousting tournaments throughout the 1980s. Fellow member Ulla Salin described him as nice, sympathetic, and talented at fighting in plate armor. His sister, Michelle Brewer, reached by the Desert Sun, confirmed she had not spoken to him in approximately 10 years. "He's always been just a wanderer," she said. In August of 2013, a Swedish friend helped him travel to Uddevalla in western Sweden, where he built a new life working as a tennis coach. He told local newspaper Bohuslänningen, "I feel born again. I'm so lucky. It feels like the town has received me as an ordinary person and not as a psycho." He was found dead in his Swedish home on the 22nd of April, 2014, approximately 1 year after the Palm Springs incident. Police did not suspect foul play. Transient global amnesia layered with a dissociative fugue state is a documented neurological event, typically triggered by physical or emotional trauma, in which the hippocampus temporarily suspends access to established memories. In fugue states, the brain can suppress the dominant personality and its associated language while leaving a secondary identity and its language accessible. The mechanics exist in the literature. This is a known, if rare, failure mode of human memory architecture. But transient global amnesia as a diagnostic label does not account for the completeness of what happened. Boatwright did not experience a language deficit layered on top of his existing identity. He became someone else. Different name, different face in the mirror, different country, different life story. The label explains a mechanism. It does not explain why the replacement was so total, so consistent, and so permanent that he never recovered his American self at all. Some researchers in dissociative identity studies suggest the brain does not erase a persona, but suppresses it, which would mean that somewhere inside Johann Eck, Michael Boatwright may have still existed, unable to surface. How many latent selves does any given brain carry, and what keeps one of them primary, day after day, for an entire lifetime? Boatwright lost himself in a motel room. The next person lost himself on a soccer field, and he was 16 years old, and his first words back were in a language his own mother could not speak. Ruben Nsemo. The year is 2016, Gwinnett County, Georgia. A 16-year-old goalkeeper named Ruben Nsemo dives for a loose ball during a regional league soccer game and takes a boot directly to the skull. He stops breathing several times on the field. His coach, Bruno Kalonji, standing on the sideline, later said, "I thought I was going to lose him there." Nsemo is airlifted to Atlanta Medical Center and placed in a coma for 3 days. When he wakes up, he is hungry. He says in Spanish, "Tengo hambre." His mother, Dora Nsemo, a 54-year-old teacher originally from Nigeria, was in the room. Her son stirred, gestured for food, and then spoke. She told Time magazine, "I was very shocked. That's something he's never done before." She ran out to find help and brought back a nurse. The nurse asked what language the family spoke. Dora said, "English. He speaks English. We're not Spanish-based people." His first documented attempt to speak English after the Spanish emerged triggered a seizure. Ruben Nsemo was a monolingual English speaker. He had some minimal passive exposure to Spanish. His brother had previously studied in Spain, and Spanish-speaking teammates occasionally taught him phrases on the field. By every family account, he had never been fluent, never been comfortable, never held a conversation in Spanish. After the coma, he could not speak English. His Spanish, in his own description, flowed like second nature. He was not retrieving scattered phrases, he was holding conversations. His first documented post-coma words, "Tengo hambre," I am hungry, were reported by Time, CNN, Fox Sports, and WSB Radio in Atlanta in October of 2016. This was Nsemo's third concussion, and doctors warned the family about the cumulative risks of traumatic brain injury for young athletes with multiple concussive events. The family's medical bills surpassed $250,000, and a GoFundMe page was established by his school community. Neurolinguist Michael Paradis of McGill University told reporters that the case was not that rare in the context of brain trauma affecting dominant hemisphere language circuits, and suggested that dormant neural circuits can be awakened by the flooding of the brain with excitatory chemicals after a fall. Psychology. Today reported in October of 2016 that his exposure to his teammate's Spanish apparently gave rise to dormant neural circuits awakened by the trauma. And a near-perfect inverse relationship was documented in the weeks that followed. As his English returned, his Spanish faded in almost exact proportion, one language retreating as the other advanced. His brain scans, according to family reports, suggested full neurological recovery was expected. Paradis and other neurolinguists describe this as a form of bilingual aphasia in a second language dominant presentation. The trauma disrupted the English circuit, which had the most deeply established neural pathways and paradoxically the most to lose from disruption, while the less established Spanish circuit, organized differently and stored in different regions, remained accessible and took over by default. The apparent fluency, according to this view, was partly produced by the absence of competition. With English offline, Spanish ran without interference. But the passive exposure explanation has a boundary it cannot easily cross. Insimo had not studied Spanish. He had overheard his brother's stories and caught phrases from teammates on a field. That is ambient contact, not instruction. And what emerged from the coma was not a handful of phrases, but a functioning conversational system. He held exchanges, he communicated. He reported that speaking it felt effortless in a way English did not. Supposedly, you cannot feel a language as second nature if the encoding was never deep enough to produce working fluency. What if language acquisition operates on a spectrum of depth that is entirely invisible until disruption forces a reveal? If the brain is silently building language maps from every casual, involuntary exposure, from overheard conversations, from background sound, from phrases caught without intention, then perhaps the question isn't only how he spoke Spanish. Perhaps the question is how much language is quietly assembling in all of us right now, from environments we're barely paying attention to. From a soccer field in suburban Georgia, we crossed the Atlantic to a motorway in the English Midlands, where a young man would wake up speaking French and believing, with complete conviction, that he was a Hollywood film star. Rory Curtis. August of 2012. Rory Curtis is 22, a semi-professional footballer once on Manchester United's youth radar. His transit van collides with an articulated lorry on the M42 motorway near Tamworth, Staffordshire. 5 more vehicles pile into the wreckage. Firefighters spend 40 minutes cutting him free from the wreckage before he is airlifted to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Birmingham. When he wakes from a 6-day induced coma, he is speaking fluent French, and he is absolutely certain he is Matthew McConaughey. The first nurse who spoke to him happened to be from a French-speaking region of Africa. She understood him immediately, then came out to find his parents and asked what side of the family was French. His mother, Vera, 57 years old, answered, "None." Curtis later told the Daily Mail, "I was just casually chatting away about how I was feeling in this perfect French accent. I can't explain how it happened." As for the identity, when he was helped to the bathroom and saw himself in the mirror, he told reporters, "I was shocked because I didn't look like him. I didn't know what I was looking at." He had been expecting Matthew McConaughey. He found Rory Curtis and didn't recognize him. His injuries were severe: a shattered hip, a broken elbow, a multifocal intracranial brain hemorrhage, and a diffused brain injury. Doctors initially warned his family he might never walk or speak normally again. He was documented by the Daily Mail in 2014, Time magazine in 2014, Al Arabiya English, and the NIHR Surgical Reconstruction and Microbiology Research Center at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Birmingham. He was only the second patient in the UK to receive an experimental progesterone-based brain injury treatment through the NIHR's Synapse clinical trial, and his consultant, Professor Tony Belli, described his condition on arrival as critical, later calling his recovery remarkable. The McConaughey belief resolved by November of 2012, 3 months after the accident, when Curtis was discharged from hospital. The French fluency did not resolve alongside it. It was still present in interviews conducted 2 years later. Curtis himself told reporters, "I didn't even do French at GCSE, so haven't studied it since year 9. Then all of a sudden, I'm fluent in it." He had studied French for approximately 2 years at school, abandoned it at around 13 or 14, and not used it in the decade since. He recovered full mobility within approximately 2 months, returned to football, and opened his own barber salon in Worcester in 2019. Neurologists attribute the French to second language retrieval during the acute disruption phase, a mechanism similar in their framing to what occurred with McMahon's Mandarin and Ensemo's Spanish. The language was encoded during those 2 school years, stored in neural subsystems separate from his dominant English, and became temporarily more accessible when the English dominant circuits were disrupted. The McConaughey belief is attributed to confabulation, a disoriented brain filling an identity gap with the most recently available familiar template, which in Curtis's case happened to be a character from a comedy he had been watching obsessively before falling ill. But the 2 anomalies did not resolve on the same timeline. The McConaughey belief faded within weeks as the brain healed and reality reasserted itself. The French remained 2 years later. If both emerged from the same injury and the same disruption, why did one resolve completely and the other persist? Either the French circuit was permanently altered while the identity circuit healed, or the French was real, pre-existing knowledge that the injury did not create, but simply released. Curtis himself raised a possibility his father took seriously enough to research. Could generational linguistic heritage be encoded in ways current science hasn't measured? The Curtis family traces its ancestry to Normandy in the 1800s. He raised it himself. And 2 years after the accident, nobody had been able to tell him why he could still speak French. From the English Midlands, we crossed to the Adriatic coast of Croatia, where a 13-year-old girl fell into a coma nobody could explain, and woke speaking a language better than she had ever studied it. The Croatian girl. Sometime in April of 2010, a 13-year-old girl from the southern Croatian town of Knin falls into a coma. No one is entirely sure why. The cause, vaguely attributed to blood poisoning, is never fully established in the public record. The coma lasts 24 hours. When she wakes, she does not speak to her parents in Croatian. She cannot. She has apparently forgotten it entirely. She speaks to them in German. And her German is better than it has ever been in her life. Hospital director Dujamir Marasovic declined to identify the girl publicly, citing her privacy, but confirmed the case to the Croatian press. The story was first reported by Croatian daily 24 Sada, which noted that the girl's German was much better than she could ever have learned at school. The hospital brought in a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and multiple specialists. Hospital staff provided an interpreter so her parents could communicate with their own daughter. She could understand Croatian when spoken to her, but she could only respond in German. The girl had recently begun studying German at school. She had supplemented those classes by reading German books and watching German television independently, by personal choice rather than for any school assignment. Her parents insisted she was nowhere near fluent. After the 24-hour coma, her Croatian production was entirely gone. She could comprehend her mother tongue, but could not produce a single word in response. The German she was producing was described by the doctors who heard it as perfect, superior, by every available assessment to anything the classroom had given her. The case received international coverage. ABC News reported on it on the 22nd of April, 2010, alongside NBC News, the BBC, and Croatian outlet B92. Neuropsychiatrist and court expert Dr. Mijo Milas, who examined the girl, stated publicly that the case was impossible to medically explain, a declaration he made within 24 hours of her waking. He further noted that in earlier times this would have been referred to as a miracle. He added a detail that is easy to overlook. There are references, he said, to cases where people who have been seriously ill and perhaps in a coma have woken up being able to speak other languages, sometimes even the biblical languages such as that spoken in Old Babylon or Egypt. Neurolinguist Michael Paradis of McGill University told NBC News the case was plausible to some extent under a bilingual aphasia framework, suggesting that swelling in the left hemisphere may have suppressed Croatian while sparing the German learning regions. And neuroscientist Stephen Novella of Yale University wrote in his Neurologica blog that the most scientifically significant detail was not the German emerging, but the Croatian disappearing, asking whether she could have an unusual form of aphasia impairing her ability to access Croatian, leaving her only able to speak German. Without Croatian competing for activation, he wrote, the German must have sounded considerably more fluent to everyone in the room. The most credible medical interpretation is selective bilingual aphasia. The trauma compressed or disrupted the neural regions housing Croatian, her dominant first language, while sparing the regions where her recently acquired German was being stored. Because German was less deeply embedded, it may have been organized in areas not affected by the pressure. The result, a hierarchy inversion, native tongue suppressed, foreign tongue dominant. But the fluency exceeds the input. Her parents, her teachers, and the hospital staff all agreed. The German she was producing was better than what school had given her. The swelling theory explains why Croatian went offline. It does not explain why German appeared to go online at a level the classroom had never reached. If swelling merely unblocked what was stored should be proportional to what was learned. By every account, it was not. The girl had been watching German television on her own, not for school, but out of personal interest. If passive media exposure builds latent language architecture that exceeds the level of conscious instruction, then what we call learning a language may be only a fraction of what the brain actually acquires from sustained exposure. Suppose she had built more German than she or anyone knew. What would that mean for every language we have passively surrounded ourselves with, and then assumed we never really learned? A 13-year-old girl's brain hid a language better than anyone knew. The next brain had been hiding one for 70 years, and it took a stroke to bring it back to the surface. Alan Morgan, 2012. Alan. Morgan is 81 years old and sitting at home in Bathwick, Somerset, watching the lunchtime news. His wife Yvonne notices that he has stopped responding. She calls an ambulance. He spends the next 3 weeks in hospital, stabilized, assessed, and treated for a severe stroke. When he regains consciousness and begins to speak, his wife, who grew up in Wales and speaks Welsh fluently, understands every word. No one else in the room does. The hospital staff brought in a translator. His wife served as his interpreter. The situation was medically surreal. An 81-year-old Englishman communicating in Welsh in an English hospital in Somerset. What complicated the situation further was the history. During World War II, Morgan had been evacuated to a Welsh-speaking community as a young child, one of thousands of British children relocated from cities during the Blitz. He lived with his grandmother, surrounded by Welsh speakers. He left Wales at approximately 10 years old. He had not been back. That was 70 years before the stroke. Morgan never formally learned Welsh. He lived in a Welsh-speaking environment for several childhood years, but, by his own account, it never consciously clicked. He had not used the language in 7 decades. After the stroke, he was producing Welsh at a level his Welsh-speaking wife could follow. Not fragments, not phonemes, but functional, followable language. His English returned 3 days later. the Welsh faded. In a BBC and Telegraph video from 2012, he is shown speaking both languages briefly before the Welsh retreated. His case was documented by the Independent, Medical Daily, the Telegraph, and the BBC. Doctors diagnosed him with aphasia, described by Medical Daily as a form of brain damage which causes a shift in the brain's language center. He was assisted in recovery by the Communication Support Service run by the Stroke Association in Bath. Morgan told media, "I'd not lived in Wales since I was evacuated there during the war. Gradually, the English words came back, but it wasn't easy." A parallel case published in Neurology in 1997 documented a Dutch-born American who reverted to Dutch, his childhood language, after a left parietal hemorrhagic stroke, despite decades of dominant English use. Linguists describe this as reversion to first exposure language after dominant language circuit disruption. Language acquisition research consistently identifies early childhood as a neurologically privileged period for encoding. The plasticity of that window may produce storage that is deeper and more resilient than anything acquired in adulthood. At 70 years, Morgan's case reportedly represents one of the longest documented gaps between language exposure and post-trauma retrieval in any published or reported case. Neurolinguists describe what happened as first exposure reversion. Language encoded during childhood, even without formal instruction, is laid down during a period of maximal neural plasticity. These early encodings may be stored more durably than later acquired languages that lack the same depth of neural embedding. When the stroke disrupted his dominant English, used for more than 70 years, it left intact a Welsh system encoded before age 10, because that earlier encoding was neurologically deeper and located in regions the stroke did not reach. The brain defaulted to the oldest available system. But Morgan himself said he did not learn Welsh. He was surrounded by it, as Ensemo was surrounded by Spanish, as the Croatian girl surrounded herself with German television. And as far as he knew, it never clicked. Yet what emerged from the stroke was not fragments. His Welsh-speaking wife could hold a conversation with him and translate for a room full of people who had no idea what he was saying. If that level of functional language came from passive childhood immersion alone, then the gap between what we call learning and what the brain actually stores may be far wider than anyone formally teaches. Morgan's case may represent the purest available evidence for a possibility that neuroscience approaches carefully. That the brain does not forget languages, but loses access to them. 7 decades of disuse did not erase the Welsh. The stroke simply removed something long enough for what was underneath to emerge. If languages encoded in childhood can survive 70 years of dormancy and then a stroke, what else is stored in us from every environment we have ever inhabited and have forgotten? From the hills of Somerset, we cross to the southwest coast of England, where a woman's brain will do something that requires no coma, no head injury, and no trauma at all. Just a headache. Sarah Colwill. Sarah Colwill goes to bed one night with a severe migraine. She does not hit her head, she does not fall into a coma, she does not have a stroke. She simply wakes up. And when she speaks, everyone who hears her thinks she is Chinese. Colwill is a native of Devon in southwest England, a region with one of the most distinctly recognizable accents in the country. After the migraine, her speech had shifted so completely that listeners consistently described her as sounding Chinese. She had never visited China. She spoke no Mandarin or Cantonese. She had no family connections to East Asia. She could not stop it. It persisted not for days but for years. Long enough for the BBC to produce a full-length documentary about her case, broadcast in September of 2013 as part of a medical mystery series. The case is listed on the formal Wikipedia entry for foreign accent syndrome as one of the primary media-covered examples of the condition alongside Astrid L. and George Michael. She was examined by specialists in foreign accent syndrome who confirmed the diagnosis. The 2016 review Foreign Accent Syndrome as a Psychogenic Disorder, published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, documented multiple cases of FAS with migraine-only onset, confirming this as a recognized subtype of the condition. Severe migraines can produce temporary ischemia, reduced blood flow, to Broca's area and its surrounding premotor cortex. This vascular disruption can produce articulatory changes that are, according to medical literature, perceptually indistinguishable from stroke-caused FAS without leaving a permanent structural mark visible on imaging. A 2019 analysis of 49 foreign accent syndrome patients found that FAS arising from migraines or vascular events without structural injury accounted for a small but consistent subset of all documented cases. And Colwell had zero documented prior exposure to Chinese, distinguishing her case from every other case on this list, all of whom had some degree of prior contact, however minimal, with the language that emerged. The vascular disruption during an extreme migraine temporarily reduces blood flow to specific motor speech regions. If that ischemia affects the circuits controlling articulatory precision, the microsecond-level coordination of lips, tongue, jaw, and larynx, the resulting speech distortion can be perceptually indistinguishable from neurogenic FAS caused by stroke. Because migraines leave no permanent structural mark, the condition may persist or recur without a clear anatomical explanation visible on imaging. The mechanism in this framing is vascular rather than traumatic, but the outcome is the same. But Colwell had no prior exposure to Chinese. A mechanical disruption to her speech articulators produced an output that every listener labeled as Chinese. If the accent is purely random articulatory damage, why does it produce something that maps so specifically and consistently to one foreign language family, and a language family the speaker has no history with? Supposedly, the output of random motor disruption should scatter unpredictably. Instead, it landed on a single, recognizable identity and stayed there for years. This may be the case that most directly challenges the passive exposure theory. If Colwell had no exposure to Chinese and still produced something universally identified as Chinese, then either the brain's damaged articulatory output randomly produced a phonetic pattern that happens to overlap with Chinese prosody, a coincidence so precise it strains the word. Or there is something about the acoustic signature of disrupted English speech that, in certain damage patterns, resembles the prosodic structure of tonal languages by default. Some researchers believe the former. Others argue the latter. Neither explanation has been confirmed. Both remain open. We may never know which one is right or whether the truth is something neither camp has yet proposed. Colwell's Chinese accent emerged from a migraine and stayed for years. The next voice changed for just 2 days. But they were 2 days in which one of the most famous accents in the world was replaced by one nobody expected, from a place the speaker had never lived. George Michael. George Michael was born in North London, raised in North London, and spent 30 years making his North London voice one of the most recognizable in the world. In November of 2011, he was admitted to a hospital in Vienna with severe pneumonia. Doctors kept him alive for 3 weeks. When he opened his eyes and doctors asked him if he knew who he was, the first thing he said was, "I'm the king of the world," in a thick West Country accent, from a part of England he had never lived in. Michael revealed the story publicly on LBC Radio in London in July of 2012, prefacing it with the words, "I swear this is true." His doctors, he told the interviewer, feared he had developed foreign accent syndrome and might speak in the West Country accent permanently. His sisters, who were in the room when he woke, were laughing. They were so relieved he was alive that they found it funny. The doctors were not finding it funny. The accent lasted 2 days. Then it faded. His North London voice returned. The event was documented in interviews with LBC Radio, BBC Radio 2 with Chris Evans, NME, Medical Express, and CBS Health Pop. The coma had lasted 3 weeks, caused by severe pneumonia. Michael later described the period to BBC Radio as one during which doctors had been keeping him alive, and acknowledged it had been touch and go. His medical team specifically recognized foreign accent syndrome as a diagnostic possibility and monitored him with it in mind. Neurologist Dr. Ronald Canner, chair of neurology at Long Island Jewish Medical Center, explained to CBS that changes following brain injury are not truly foreign accents, but injuries to the language areas in the brain that cause people to pronounce things differently, which to untrained ears can sound like a foreign accent. Michael released a song about the experience titled White Light in 2012. The 2-day duration of the accent is consistent with transient FAS presentations documented in BMJ case reports and ASHA literature, where FAS arising from non-structural events can resolve within hours to weeks without therapeutic intervention. Michael's self-proposed explanation was specific and characteristically self-deprecating. In the weeks before falling ill, he said, he had been obsessively watching the BBC dark comedy Nighty Night set in Bristol and featuring a distinct West Country female lead. He and an Australian friend had been doing extensive impressions of the character, repeatedly, together, in the weeks leading up to his hospitalization. His brain, disrupted by 3 weeks of severe illness, may have temporarily lost access to his native prosodic patterns and substituted the most recently practiced template instead. As his brain healed, the original patterns reasserted themselves. 2 days. Clean resolution. The mainstream explanation in this case is also the most entertaining one. But Michael's doctors in Vienna did not know about Nighty Night. They did not know about the impressions. To the medical team treating him, it was an unexplained accent emergence, and their concern that it might be permanent was a standard clinical response to a documented neurological event, not a theatrical one. The television explanation was Michael's, not theirs. If the brain can substitute a recently rehearsed accent during a prosodic gap, every accent you have practiced, every impression you have done, every foreign film you have absorbed repeatedly, according to this logic, all of it may be filed somewhere as a potential replacement. The question it leaves behind is personal in a way that few medical phenomena are. What has your brain been rehearsing? What would fill your prosodic gap if something disrupted your speech circuits tonight? The strangest question of all, though, doesn't come from any of these modern cases. It comes from 1907, from the very first case ever recorded, a case that has never been explained, from a doctor who simply wrote down what he saw and passed the mystery forward to everyone who came after him. Pierre Marie's patient, 1907, Paris, France. A man who had been born in Paris, raised in Paris, and lived his entire life in Paris suffered a brain hemorrhage. When he recovered his speech, his Parisian French was gone. In its place was something every listener who heard him immediately recognized: the accent of Alsace, a region more than 350 kilometers away, a region he had no documented connection to, a region that in 1907 was under German occupation following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And nobody then, or in the 115 years since, has been able to fully explain why. Dr. Pierre Marie was one of the founding architects of modern clinical neurology, the physician who also first described Charcot-Marie tooth disease. He noted the post-hemorrhage accent change and published it in 1907 as an observation of accent deviation during aphasic recovery. He had no name for what he was describing. The condition would not have a formal name for another 75 years. He simply wrote it down because he did not recognize it and because it seemed important to record. He was right on both counts. His 1907 report is cited as the first documented case of foreign accent syndrome in every published review of the condition, including the American Speech-Language Hearing Association Overview, the formal synthesis of FAS literature, and the 2025 Frontiers in Psychology Historical Analysis of FAS Case Documentation. The term foreign accent syndrome was not coined until 1982, 75 years after this first case, when neurolinguist Harry Whittaker named and formalized the diagnosis, drawing on Marie's case and Monrad Krohn's 1947 documentation of Astrid L. as the two foundational pillars. Between 1907 and 2009, only 62 cases were formally documented across more than a century of clinical observation. Since 2000, however, documentation has accelerated dramatically. According to the Science History Institute, 93% of all known FAS cases have appeared in the neurological literature in just the first 25 years of this century, suggesting not that the condition became more common, but that awareness and diagnostic precision improved enough to recognize and record it. Subsequent landmark early case followed in 1919, when Czech neurologist Arnold Pick documented a Czech butcher who developed a Polish accent after a left hemisphere stroke with no prior documented exposure to Polish. And the meta-analysis of 112 patients bears repeating here: 67% female, 97% adults, and only 12.5% with any prior documented exposure to the accent that emerged. That means that in more than 87% of all documented cases across 115 years of medical record, the accent that surfaces after brain injury corresponds to a language or regional variety the patient has no confirmed prior contact with. After more than a century, the consensus explanation is this: foreign accent syndrome is a motor speech disorder. The damaged brain regions control the millisecond-level coordination of lips, tongue, jaw, and larynx that produces native-sounding speech. When those circuits are disrupted, the output changes, not into another language, but into the native language with altered timing, pitch, and stress. Listeners interpret that altered pattern through their own cultural reference points and assign the nearest available label. The accent in this framing is not in the mouth. It is in the ear of whoever happens to be listening. But the 87% figure won't let go. If the accent were truly in the ear, purely a projection by the listener onto random articulatory damage, the listener interpretations should be inconsistent, varying widely from person to person. Instead, they cluster. Different listeners, hearing the same patient, identify the same foreign language. Not always the same country, but often the same language family. Something in the specific damage pattern produces something that isn't random noise. And after 115 years, no one has fully explained what that something is. Pierre Marie wrote down one case in 1907 because he couldn't explain it and thought someone else might. That person has not arrived yet. A century and 2 decades of neuroscience, linguistics, brain imaging, and clinical documentation later, the core question is in exactly the same place he left it. Why does a damaged brain, when it produces distorted speech, so often produce distortion that maps, specifically consistently, recognizably, to the prosodic structure of a real human language. Not noise, not random phonetic debris, a language, one that listeners can name, one that carries a cultural identity, one that the speaker, in the great majority of cases, has never formally spoken or studied. From a Parisian clinic in 1907 to a soccer field in Georgia in 2016, from the streets of occupied Oslo to the wards of a Palm Springs hospital, 10 people opened their mouths after something went wrong in their brains. What came out was not supposed to be there. Here is what all 10 cases share. And it is not what the headlines focus on. It is not the drama of the coma, the head injury, or the migraine. It is not the celebrity angle or the legal strangeness of a man who doesn't recognize his own name on a government document. The thing that connects every person on this list is simpler and stranger than any of those. In every single instance, a brain was disrupted. And what it produced was not silence, not noise, not random phonetic wreckage. It produced something recognizable, something with structure, something that other human beings could hear and label and assign to a place in the world. The mainstream explanation accounts for some of that. Motor speech disruption, prosodic pareidolia, dormant circuit activation. These are real mechanisms, documented in peer-reviewed literature, described by named researchers at named institutions. They account for how the damage changes the output. They do not account for why the output consistently resembles a human language rather than meaningless sound. The meta-analysis of 112 patients found that more than 87% of foreign accent syndrome cases involve accents with no documented prior exposure. That number has been sitting in the medical literature for years. Supposedly, no one has fully explained it. The alternative is not a clean answer either. It is, at best, a cluster of questions that some researchers are willing to ask out loud. What if passive exposure stores far more than we consciously access? What if childhood immersion encodes languages that persist for decades, as Alan Morgan's 70-year dormant Welsh seems to suggest? What if the brain carries sonic maps of every environment it has ever inhabited in depths that our current imaging cannot reach? And what if brain injury doesn't create new language at all, but simply removes a lock from a door that was always there? We don't know. We may never know. Some researchers believe the brain's language architecture is far deeper and more extensive than our daily outputs suggest. Others maintain that the accent is entirely constructed by the listener, and the speaker's mouth produces nothing but degraded motor patterns. Both views cannot be entirely right, neither can be entirely dismissed. What we do know is that Pierre Marie wrote down one case in 1907 because he couldn't explain it and believed it was worth recording. 115 years later, with better scanners and better models and better tools than Marie could have imagined, the question is in exactly the same place he left it. Most people hear a story like Ben McMahon's and file it under strange medical thing and move on. But you are still here. That means you noticed the same gap that has been open since 1907. The gap between the explanation that is offered and the thing it cannot quite reach. That gap is not a failure of science, it is an invitation. And the people most likely to contribute something useful to it are not the ones who accepted the first available answer. They are the ones who kept asking why. Go to the comments. Pick the one case from this list that you think is hardest to explain with the framework we currently have. Not the most dramatic, the hardest to explain. Make your argument. Push back on each other. That conversation is worth having. Subscribe. You're already doing the work. Ben McMahon opened his eyes in a Melbourne ICU, and his first words were in a language he had never fully spoken. Somewhere between the moment the truck hit and the moment he opened his mouth, something shifted in his brain. Some circuit that was supposedly dormant found its way to the surface, and what came out was not what anyone in that room was expecting. All 10 people on this list had that moment, a before and an after, a self that opened its mouth and heard something unfamiliar come out. The brain has been keeping secrets for at least 115 years. What else is in there?